I now call this committee of the whole meeting of the Davenport Community School District Board of Directors to order. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Director Potts to lead the discussion tonight. Director Potts?
As you know, this evening we're going to have the presentation on the results of the survey that the public has taken, and then we're going to engage in get some other information, and then just have a Q&A on that information from the board members and student board members. And after that point, we'll just see where we are in the process. I'll turn it over to the superintendent to make introductions.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I'm incredibly proud of is the process that Bray has helped push us through so far. It's been a very rigorous process, and one of the key components of that is getting the voice of every member of our community, and that's exactly what we're here to talk about tonight. The survey that we decided to use for this process, I think now that the survey's back in the House, one of the pieces of feedback that we received was, well, what type of survey was this? This survey was utilized as a planning survey for the district. It helps us at a fork in the road, which pathway are we going to choose? And the board has made a commitment to utilize data to move forward, data and input from the community. So this is one of the very key components to that. We've had this date circled on our calendar as from this moment forward, the heavy lift is going to occur. Want to echo the feedback that we received. We need more information. Now is the time when the information comes, starting tonight. And that's is a critical step. And I want to give our school board a celebratory pat on the back, because it is so difficult not to move forward and listening to our community as they have spoken. And now is the time to do that, utilizing this very important tool. With us tonight, we have Matt and John from Bray Architects, and I believe Bill is online somewhere. There he is. Bill, you're on a giant screen inside of our boardroom. And so I'll turn it over to Matt from Bray. So thank you guys for being here tonight.
Bruce, for the introduction. The goal for tonight, as TJ noted, was to see what the survey said. And so I will turn it directly over to Bill, and obviously if there's continued conversation after that, I'll turn it back to President Gosa to facilitate those discussions.
All right. Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. So again, I'm Bill Foster. I'm the president of School Perceptions, and my job tonight is to tell you what the survey said. So this report was created actually just end of last week. We're still getting a few paper surveys in. We will provide the board with a final report, but from a statistical standpoint, nothing's going to change from what you're going to see tonight. The report is organized in really three areas. Everything that's in this report, that was in the survey is going to be in the report. So that background information that was provided to set up the context for the responses, you'll see that. We're going to take a look at the demographic information and then slice and dice and try to make sense of the data for you. And then we'll wrap up with some time for questions and answers. So again, School Perceptions, we've been around for over 20 years, and we've done over 900 projects like this to help school district plan for bond referendums. In your case, your process was an inclusive process, and every household in the district was mailed a paper survey and had the opportunity to participate. They could either do it online. We used a unique alphanumeric code that could be used once, but only once, or they could fill it out by a paper and pencil. They mailed it back to us, and we entered that data in. So as of the time of writing this report, we had 4,409 total responses. 1,203 came back by a paper. There was a total of 47,881 sent. So you're just under 10%. Which is a very good response rate for a district your size, but probably most importantly, from a statistical margin of error, you had plus or minus 1.51%. When I was waiting tonight to present, just out of curiosity, I thought, well, what if we would have got 8,000 people to take it, and the response or the margin of error would have dropped down to 1.15%. So it just doesn't change a lot when you get to these high numbers. First question we asked was, what is your age? When I look at this slide, I always go to the top. I want to make sure our seniors are well represented in the data, which they are. They're actually a bit overrepresented. I looked at the 2021 census in Davenport, and you're at 17.8%, so you're actually 4% over. But when it comes to voting, your seniors tend to turn out at a higher percentage rate than your 18 to 24-year-olds. Is your primary residence in the district? Well, 94% of our sample said yes to that. 6% said no, which raises the question, who are these people taking our survey that don't live in our district? Primarily two groups. One is staff. So there's some staff that did participate, but they don't live in the district, as well as parents who choose to open enroll into the district. Those would be your two groups that primarily make up that 6%. We are going to remove any non-residents from the funding support question. So you're going to see the word resident show up in just a second when we get to the funding support. We also asked, in which township do you live? We had just over 78% of our sample were from Davenport. And then after that, the remaining kind of split out to the Bluegrass, Walcott, Buffalo, and then just a few from Hickory Grove, Montpelier, and Cleona. We had 20% of our sample that were staff, and we had 48% of our sample were parents. We had one question on the survey that had to do with communication. How would you like to receive information? Here we thought it made sense to take the staff out completely because we've got our own internal modes of communication with staff. So we looked at the parents first. By far, their number one first choice are emails at 85%. Then they go down to phone notifications at 43%, and then they'll check out a newsletter and go to the website. For our non-parent, non-staff, we call those the purple people, and they're arguably the most important group because they represent the majority of your voters. Their number one was TV and radio, closely followed by the Quad City Times. So about half of our non-parent, non-staff are reading the Times. Then we drop down to 30% for newsletters and websites. So again, everything that was in this report, or I'm sorry, in the survey is in the report. So the background information that was provided talked about the fact that you're in a declining enrollment situation. You've got excess capacity at all your schools. You've got some aging buildings and some outdated classrooms. So then your facility master planning committee came up with a plan to downsize and right size by closing buildings, renovating, and consolidating operations. We developed two pathways to test in the survey. Pathway 1 identified a plan that would put in place 12 elementary schools, 6 intermediate, and 3 high schools. We described the Pathway 1 plan and how that would be done in phases. And then we had Pathway 2 plan, which had the 15 elementary schools and 5 intermediates. Again, as TJ said at the beginning, this is really a planning survey. So we're trying to decide, should we turn left? Should we turn right? And we got some data back that said, which pathway would you support? We broke this into staff, parents, and non-parents, non-staffs. In other words, 3 mutually exclusive subgroups. If you're a staff member and also a parent, we put you in the staff, then the parents, and then the purple people, the non-parent, non-staff. And the options were only supporting 1, only supporting 2, supporting either, undecided, or not supporting either pathway. To help you make sense of the data, what I did was I combined the folks that said they'd be willing to support either. And here we begin to see a pattern where Pathway 2 has really more support for our staff at 52 to 44, more support from our parents at 42 to 29, and more support from our non-parent, non-staff. So Pathway 2 appears to be, I don't know if that's turning left or turning right, but that's the path that the plurality of the subgroups have you support moving towards. Then we get to funding support. We explain that we have some funding options outside of a bond referendum through the penny sales tax and the Pebble funding to do some of this work, but we wanted to test an $85 million bond to complete either pathway of the first phase. We explained what the tax impact would be for at a residential, commercial, and ag level. And then we asked, assuming the pathway chosen was acceptable to you, would you support an $85 million bond referendum? Again, looking at these three mutually exclusive subgroups, first being the staff, 53% of the staff said they would definitely or probably yes support that. 28% said were undecided. In my world, when we look at this data, typically you're around 10% that are undecided. There's usually 1 out of 10 folks that will never make up their mind. They're undecided, can't decide. But in your case, you have almost 30% of your staff, which tells me that they're going to need some more information about what you're going to do. And you'll be able to do that once you decide what pathway you go down. The same thing was true for parents. We were at 43% saying yes, 27% saying no. And 30% of the parents want more information before deciding. Again, I think as TJ said, the work begins maybe after the survey here. And our non-parent, non-staff purple people were at 42% yes, 40% no, with 18% still a pretty high percent of undecided folks waiting to see and needing a little bit more information before they decide. So I did do some additional analysis. So this basically what this does is I took the staff out completely, because although staff is very, very important because they're talking to their friends, their neighbors, and parents every day, they represent less than 1% of your voters. So I'm assuming about 25% of your community is made up of parents and 75% are those non-parent, non-staff. And of those who said yes, I would support, I landed at 42.25. If we could pick up a third of the undecided, I moved up to 49.25. But in Iowa, we need 60%. So at this point, we don't have support for this plan. But again, I think as more information provided, it will probably move in a direction where people can begin to have a more informed opinion. One other section we had in the survey we had to do with future planning, beginning to cast a new vision. Davenport Community Schools want to be the district of choice. And we created a planning baseline for you. So how is the district doing in each of the following areas? You could be great, good, fair, or poor. If everybody said we're doing great, we'd be a 4. If everyone said we're doing poor, we'd be a 1. And you can see we're kind of in that 2 range across the board for delivering a high quality education, keeping the public informed, managing funds appropriately, and building pride in the community. So again, this is valuable as you establish your strategic plan moving forward. You can measure your success against this baseline data for each of the 3 subgroups. We had one question: how would you how likely would you be to recommend the district to a friend or family member? Here you could be from extremely likely to extremely unlikely. So we created a weighted average, and you ended up at a 5.26. So I guess the rhetorical question is, what did we learn by doing this survey? We learned that a majority of all subgroups support the district pursuing pathway 2 over pathway 1 to downsize and right size the district. And an $85 million bond referendum to help fund the first phase of the plan would not be supported at this time, but I think there's work to be done to figure out just exactly what we would do if we head down pathway 2. How would those buildings be updated, reconfigured, and whatnot? And then I think as more information comes in, then you may be in a position to test the bond referendum to help fund the project. So let me pause there and answer questions that the board might have.
Director Beck?
I just have one quick question. And I don't know if you would know the answer to this, but when we're asking about taxpayers' willingness to support a bond referendum, how does the economic condition of the nation, the district, the area, like right now we have very high inflation. How does that affect people's responses or willingness to vote for a bond referendum? Is that something that you would have experience with?
It's a great question. And I think, we've been doing this for 20 years. And I would say that this is probably the most uncertain time I've ever worked in. As gas goes up, goes down, as inflation goes up or goes down, I think that has a tremendous impact on people's not only willingness, but also ability to support a bond referendum. That being said, we've done, like right now, we've done about 40 projects this semester, and there's clearly some districts and some communities that are in support of what's being proposed, and there's other ones that are not. So it does also, politics are also local, and I guess the economy is also somewhat local in terms of if there's a good plan being put out, there's still communities turning out to support them.
I would add briefly, we have 8 proposals going to bond referendum tomorrow that we're all using this process. So we'll have a little better sense of the immediacy and accuracy of these after tomorrow. The other thing I would say is some of those were tested when things were even slightly more stable. So I think this is interesting that we really did collect this data while the instability was present versus it coming up after the fact. As TJ said, we're also, any bond referendum would be, I'll say, years off in the future as we're currently thinking about it. So, and this data doesn't remain valid for years. So this was just a good way, I think, as we built this survey to foreshadow, engage a point in time of where is the community in terms of an additional investment. Likely we'll have to have conversations years down the road as to what a survey with specificity regarding timing, projects, cost, tax impact, that data then would be even more valid. But this will give us a great benchmark to compare to as we move forward.
Any other questions?
Director Gordon?
Can you please explain the purpose of including the district perceptions? How is the district doing in each of the following areas? What impact does that have on the overall results of everything else?
Well, that's a good question. And actually, during COVID, we did some research to try to answer that. And what we found is there's a very high correlation between overall satisfaction with the district and willingness to support a bond referendum. So and these are questions we use quite often. So there really is, if people are generally satisfied with the education you provide, the communications, the managing the funds and building pride, you'll tend to have and experience more support. As these numbers drop, then you tend to have less support.
Any additional questions? Anything anybody wants to add for the good of the cause? Director Posturing.
I don't have any questions on the survey, but I do have some comments after a while.
Director Beck?
I do have one question. Do we have a geographic breakdown of survey respondents? Like, did everybody who responded, come from the edges of the district? Are they all in the center? Do we have any idea?
Yeah, we don't have any GIS data to that, but what we do have is we can look at the data from township. So, which isn't the challenge with that is over 3/4 of the data comes from Davenport, the rest of the surrounding community. So we could break it out by this question, the township question, but not from a zip code or anything like that. It's truly an anonymous survey, so we don't have that.
Student board members, you have any questions?
Okay. Well, it's more of a question of how do we raise voting in younger people, because we're getting low interaction of young people voting. So how do we get them engaged? Which I don't know.
That's a good question. I'm not sure that's a survey question. I think there's a lot of people working on that probably tonight. um, but I think getting young folks involved is always critical to any important decisions. But no, I don't have any grand wisdom into mobilizing, other than having three boys of voting age myself. I'm just trying to get them to vote. But no, it's tough. It really is.
It may also hinge on whether they're living at home, because if there's one survey per household, you know, if George is living in the basement, he may
Right.
not take the survey. He'll come up to eat, but he may not take the survey.
Any other questions?
On the results of the survey and the information that have just been shared with us? Superintendent?
If there are no more comments on the results of the survey, we as an administration have been following the two pathways. And what we have been working tirelessly as an administration team and a board long-range facility planning team is preparing for what if A was chosen and what if, or pathway 1 was chosen, what if pathway 2 was chosen. And so we are prepared either way, whatever way the survey results came out. We've obviously been following it, reviewing it, and we are prepared to share some information, some possible next steps. If the board is interested in seeing possible next steps, scenarios for pathway 2, knowing that there's not a decision made tonight and that a decision can't be made tonight. But I think it would be not in our best interest to sit on our hands. So we decided to work the work behind the scenes. We realized that potentially people could say, well, you already knew what you were going to do. And that's not the case. We've been working multiple scenarios according to the process from the long-range facility plan. We think it's best to be prepared with the timeline that the board had laid out for us, that we want to make decisions in December. It's very important that we begin to move forward. So if that is something the board is interested in, after a short recess, we could ask John to fire something up on his laptop and share if you're interested in that. Bruce, I'd turn it.
Director Poston.
Yeah, just some comments, some things that have concerned me right from the start. When the two pathways were presented to us from the long-range planning group, I think at that time, I think there should have been a feeling brought forth from the board as far as what their thoughts were, rather than sitting back and waiting all this time. Because I knew from that day when that was presented, there was no way I was going to support an $85 million bond referendum. I was not going to support remodeling numerous buildings. When we originally talked about this, we talked about we need to close buildings, period. Okay? There was no mention about remodeling elementaries into junior highs. We've done this before. It doesn't work, and it's a waste of money. We've got 5,600 spaces, extra spaces, okay? So we close some buildings, and we do away with some of these spaces, but then we're going to add on to buildings, or we're going to remodel buildings. To me, this does not make sense. We've just gone through a bunch of financial issues with the district, and to turn around to close buildings and then turn around and spend $85 million, it just, to me, makes no fiscal sense at all.
Well, that discussion will take place once we reach some kind of consensus on a pathway. Because we're going to determine a pathway, and then we'll determine the nitty gritty of that pathway, whether it's this building, that building, the other building. Okay, so right now we're dealing in an umbrella concept, and then we'll be fleshing out. We have some ideas, but nothing happens without a board vote.
Well, I can already tell you right now, I will not support an $85 million bond referendum, and I will not support remodeling buildings. Maybe down in the future, yes, but not until we close some buildings, change our boundaries, and then see what we've got. Because we're still dealing with issues with open enrollment out, and until we change what's going on in our schools, that will continue. So there'll be more buildings to close. You know, there were some good comments made in open forum. Are we going to continue to just accept open enrollment out of the district, or are we going to do something about it? And that begins with discipline in the schools, the fights in the schools, and that has to change, or open enrollment out will continue.
Director Beck.
So this is for the architects. With the pathways as they've been sort of envisioned and described to us so far, it's my understanding that, you guys did like this huge survey of the age of every building and all the different parts of every building and what it would take to make sure it's up to current standards, even in terms of, technology and that kind of thing. And it's my understanding that the two pathways are basically based on the facilities themselves and not on the space in the facilities themselves and not on much of anything else. Am I correct about that?
I would say generally yes.
Okay.
Now, some of the facilities, just due to their age, arguably don't support the type of teaching and learning that you would potentially as a district team like to offer in the future. That said, that potential investment has not been an encumbrance to Mr. Passion's point of getting to closing some schools. We have kept that as priority one, focus one, phase one, if you want to call it that, in all of our conversations to date, because we know there's capacity there. Not that closing a school is easy. I'm not suggesting that. It's emotional, it's challenging, it does involve rebounding, but you are in the position whereby you can close school buildings, relocate those students into adjacent boundary, generally adjacent attendance areas, and not make an investment, not add space, take advantage of the capacity that you have available. That is the phase one we have been working on, meaning closing without investing. That is the phase one we are prepared to begin discussing when the board is ready to have those conversations.
And then my second question is, of the pathways that the public has been presented with, we haven't made any decisions, and it's my understanding that this is sort of an idea of how this would work. Either of these would work, but that, getting to the same number of spaces is not set in stone, and we have the opportunity to ask you guys to adjust how we get to that end result of X number of elementary schools, X number of junior highs, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And the numbers that were presented in long range planning conversations with the Citizens Committee and the community through those months of dialogue were always kind of the utopian framework for a district of your side. They were not the suggestion that we could get there in one phase, that there wasn't any investment needed. But we did always acknowledge, as we just discussed, that there is the ability to close schools with some urgency, with some immediacy. Yes, it will involve rebounding, but it will not require capital investments to do so.
Director Gordon?
I have two questions. My first one follows up on that. So if phase one is closing some elementaries and changing boundaries, how many times will that have to happen by the end of the process to the point of how many students will be affected by having to move multiple times?
Well, I think the first piece of that is the sixth grade to the middle school, junior high conversation. So if that eventually becomes board direction, that arguably isn't a direct impact, because that could happen as a student simply progresses. Instead of staying in their school building, right, they would simply transition a year earlier than they currently would be transitioning. The elementary attendance areas, the first phase, it could happen, I'll say soon. If we take action in December and go through student transition, staff transition, attendance area boundary work immediately in 2023, that could happen for the start of the 2023-2024 school year. When I misstate my years, please correct me, because I get them wrong all the time, but I think I got that right. Moving forward at that point, those schools generally, we believe, are approaching their target capacities when we do those relocations. Is that fair, John? And so by doing that, those attendance areas, I will say the caveat being all things being equal, like when our kindergartners come in, we're kind of similar in class size. We don't drop or grow a bunch. That's obviously a wild card that none of us can control. But assuming that the general cohort size, the number of kindergarten kids is around the same size as the outgoing in that case, once we transition, we'll be outgoing fifth grade class. Now it'd be sixth grade. We would be in a position to generally say those are good attendance areas for the schools affected today. Future additional school closures will very much depend on when they happen, how far off in the future they happen. And the nice part about that is we can be very strategic with how we go about making those changes. We could say that I'm going to make this scenario up. In 6 years, we're going to close 2 more schools. I don't know what they are. We could arguably start to modify those attendance areas whereby incoming kindergarten students go to their future home school instead of it being kind of 1 year at school A and the next year you're at school B. So that's the joy of, that's a bad word to use in talking about closure. That's the advantage of a longer on-ramp to that second phase of closure, would be that we could be a lot more deliberate with the planning. And the positive with this round is that it is relocating students into elementary schools generally that are adjacent in attendance area. And they would, I believe, and TJ, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they would finish their elementary school experience for sure in the building they transition to.
Okay, thanks. And then my next question is, I know that the surveys that went out had opportunities for people to leave comments. How were those comments used, and will we have the ability to read them?
Yes, so the comments do not factor into the quantitative data which he shared this evening. What I've heard him tell many clients is that use the quantitative data to shape your strategy and to set your course. Use the qualitative data, meaning the comments, to dig a little deeper and see if there are key areas of communication that we could improve upon. Are there areas of confusion that we thought we'd communicated effectively on but weren't? But what he'll also say is if you find a comment that is positive, you're going to probably find a comment that's negative. So it's going to become very hard. You're going to lose yourself in those comments. What they will do is prepare a comment theme analysis, which will basically be them scouring all of the comments provided, creating some themes, and they'll generally give you kind of a flavor for what those themes were. If you want to see all of them, absolutely. He can simply provide a report of all of the comments as well.
I think that it would be important for the board to have access to all the comments just for the transparency of it, because if people are filling out a survey and especially doing that part of it, they do that with the assumption that people will see them. So.
Yeah, that does take them a little time. They do read every one. They take out inappropriate responses. They will, obviously, if there's individual names or specific things, they'll redact. But other than this, so that just takes a little longer than obviously running the quantitative piece. But John and I will reach out and make sure that they know that that is something the board is interested in seeing.
Director Hayes?
there was a number of undecided individuals. Will there be additional survey with once more information is provided to see if that number changes to go more for favorable or unfavorable?
Yes, and I will say that in general, undecided as Bill noted in his presentation, at that high of a level is not atypical on a planning type survey. There's many people, I have a feeling, that took that survey that said, I'm not an educator. I don't know if fifth graders and sixth graders together are a good idea or bad idea, right? That to them is not an easy survey question to respond to, because in general, I think they're trusting not only the board, but administration and leadership, educational leadership, to make those decisions. I think the one that is a good data point to look at is when it comes to taxes, right? Everybody has an opinion on taxes. And so the best we typically see is that 1/3 of those undecideds would go yes, and 2/3 traditionally go no. Bill would tell you that generally the undecided category, Midwesterners are nice people. So there's people that they're not going to say no, they're going to say I'm undecided. But in reality, 2/3 of them are no. Generally, 1/3 may swing to yes. So there was a slide that showed some of that analysis of that 1/3 swinging yes. But it is a good point. Even when we look at the comments, maybe like narrow in on people who were undecided on the financial support question. What were their concerns? And or feedback regarding comments might be a way to get a little better sense of the why behind that.
I would suggest now, Mr. President, since we've asked our questions and some of us have said our piece, that most of our conversation is in a sort of an esoteric level, because we haven't said, okay, we're going to take the information that the public has given us in the survey and say, we're going with the reorganization as 6-8. So I would suggest if you would want to take over the conversation now, and so let us have that conversation so that we can sort of narrow our focus.
I can handle that, Director Potts. The survey results came back that overwhelmingly the public came out with they support a K6 model versus the K4 or K5. I'm sorry, K5 versus the K4 model. That's correct, right?
That is correct.
As Director Potts said, what is the board's thoughts on which pathway they would see working? The Model 1 was the K4, and Model 2, or Plan 2, or however you said it, was K5. So if we could have that conversation and kind of, because I believe you all have set up some things for the different ones with some ideas going forward. Is that correct?
We are prepared to share some scenarios, yes.
Okay. Do you want me to go around the room and ask everybody, or does anybody want to go first? All right, Director Kleindrum.
Based on the data, I support Pathway 2. I think if we're asking people and they clearly tell us Pathway 2 is what they want, then that's where we should be headed.
Yeah, I would agree, but I would also ask architects from a financial standpoint, do you have any numbers that we can also use as far as a comparison, as far as how effective we're going to be down the road on saving dollars?
We will have numbers. They're a moving target at the moment till we have better direction from the board. So we'll be able to tiptoe our way into that, which will help us in that decision-making process. Candidly, a K458 versus a K568, the K458 is a more expensive option to dig into.
Yeah, at a 30,000 foot level, it was more expensive from a capital perspective. We have really been focused on this phase one school closure analysis as priority one. That's why the kind of future investment in a 6-8 model has been a little less of a priority, knowing that we want to keep the board up to speed on those potential closures as priority one.
Director Beck.
I guess as a biologist, I'm looking at this and I don't see the overwhelming support for one pathway over the other, but definitely more support for pathway 2. And so, I think I'm perfectly happy to go with either. I'm just hesitant to say that we have been given a clear mandate at this point, but I'm not a statistician either, so I don't know if that's a statistically significant difference in terms of percentages.
I think you're right on there. I don't know at what point overwhelming. Everybody might have a different opinion on where that is, but I do think that there is enough of a difference. There is a leaning, I guess we could say, from the feedback towards one of the two pathways, and I don't know that that's overly surprising, given it's the pathway that the community knew previously, that it's the least amount of change. So I think those two probably played into it as much as anything when it comes to why people favored one over the other.
Well, and I would support either based on the data that we have, but based on if I was just going with what the public said, but it does seem like there's a leaning towards pathway 2, so I'm perfectly happy with that.
Thank you. Director Hayes.
We made quite the investment to send out the surveys, and I don't think it would be wise to not listen to what our constituents say, because that would lead to a lack of transparency, in my opinion, that your minds were already made up and you're doing what you want to do. So if this is the most popular one, then I could support pathway 2.
Thank you. Director Potts.
I'm comfortable with pathway 2.
Director Gordon.
I'm comfortable with either. I don't have a personal preference either direction, and I do think that it's important to listen to the survey respondents. So pathway 2 is fine with me.
Student board members, you want to weigh in on this?
I would just mention, so I went to middle school in the 6 through 8, so I guess that's what pathway 2 is, and I can't imagine a 5 through 8. That seems crazy, but that's my input. Also, I think it will be really interesting to see if we can get more data from the undecided sort of group and see where that leads us.
I like the idea of pathway 2 more. I support that one definitely more than the other one. The idea of a 5 through 8 school does not sit well with me. The maturity levels between a 5th grader and an 8th grader is a really big difference, and the way kids behave is not going to mesh well, in my opinion. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. I have a 4th grader, so I couldn't see her going into junior high next year. That'd be crazy. Like everyone has kind of alluded to, I think with the survey and listening to people, I could get behind pathway 2. With that being said, you all have some stuff on that, but you're going to need some time to get it up on the computer, right? So we could take a quick 5-minute break.
Yes.
All right, at this time, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. All right, we're back. Turn it back over to the superintendent.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, so Matt and I will likely tag team a little bit of this, but so we just went through the community survey. We're going to do just a real quick revisit to some of where we've been, and then we're going to jump into a little bit of thought of where we could be headed, and then we'll see how the board discussion is. We even can go further with discussion as the night goes on, based on the nature of the conversation. So as TJ said, it would be foolish of us to not be trying to plan ahead on where survey data came in. And so we've been spending these last weeks and months strategizing reactions to different outcomes of the survey. So what you're going to see here was based on the fact that the survey had a majority support for a K-5, 6-8 organizational approach to the district, which is a change to how the district is currently organized. But as one of our students says, it used to be that way. So it is not an unfamiliar territory. That being said, let's skip past our community survey. All right, this is very touchy. All right, so currently we have 17 elementary schools, 5 junior highs. We have our 4 high schools, our 1 K through 8. We're currently operating in a K through 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 orientation with the single K-8 and with the Mid-City as our specialized high school. So as we've talked before, it's a little bit unsettling when you look at the pathway for student direction. And so some of what we're going to talk about is ways to begin to address this. This does not want to change. All right. So yeah, the wheel doesn't want to do it. Yeah. Oh. It is. I think it is too far. All right. I think I can catch these arrows here. All right, so we had 2 options on the table in the community survey. The first was a K4, 5-8 organizational change to the district. That had a larger number of buildings being closed. It had a significant implication of change within the district. The community has since said that they favor the option 2, which is a K5, 6-8 grade configuration. This is something that the district could begin to move into more quickly, depending on decisions that are made. This was a 2-building closure recommendation, sticking with 5 junior high schools. And so the other goal here was, again, cleaning up the organizational pathway of how students move between buildings. Part of this is understanding how do you get there from where we're at. And that is not an easy process. It is also not attainable immediately because there's too much financial implication to the district. So the initial consideration and the charge of the board has been close buildings. There is an economic efficiency that can be gained to the district by closing buildings immediately. It does take advantage of the fact that you do have capacity in your existing buildings so that you can absorb those students into other buildings. Likely we can make decisions in a way that would not require any immediate construction to accommodate those students. So there are limits to this, but the thought is to make your closures based on what you can accomplish without having to build on to house those students. And in theory, in any kind of staged approach, what you would do is make some initial decisions, use that as a barometer to decide, do you do more? Do you do something different? And so, Director Poston, directly to your question, you're not going to jump into this all the way from the diving board. You're going to kind of wade into this and make these decisions in a series of steps, because that's going to help inform the district of how you do this. So the initial thought, and this was discussed as a component of that phase or that pathway to diagram. So that option 2 diagram utilized a 17 to 15 elementary school closure. We had a list of buildings that potentially could be considered for closing. However, through a considerable amount of study, we've determined that the district likely could close 3 buildings right out of the gate. The study's been working on closing Buchanan Elementary, Monroe Elementary, and Washington Elementary. With the capacity in the neighboring buildings, we can redistribute those students to other buildings in their region. And this is what's critical, is this is a regional based approach. You're making a closure in a region of Davenport that has other elementaries with capacity to absorb those students and also be able to accommodate that change from a boundary and transportation approach that makes this sensible. So Buchanan being in the northwest, Washington being in the east, and Monroe being in the southwest. So as I kind of expand this, Monroe would likely distribute students to 3 or 4 adjacent elementaries, which would be Jackson, Hayes, Jefferson, and Wilson. Washington would distribute their students to Madison, McKinley, and Garfield. And Buchanan would distribute their students to Fillmore, Trumore, and Harrison. Excuse me, I said Truman. What happens then? Yeah, I'll get back. I'm going to kind of zoom into this a little different, but what happens is once you make that change, you can significantly clean up the pathway of how these elementaries feed into the junior high buildings that they serve. So just from a written standpoint, we used current 22-23 enrollment to begin making projections on student enrollment counts, how many students would need to distribute to adjacent elementaries, looking at the existing capacity. So on this screen, what you're seeing is at the top, Buchanan has a current enrollment of 352 students. They would distribute to Fillmore, Harrison, and Truman. Those buildings combined have a capacity of 1,526 to 723 extra seats. If we combine all 4 buildings, we have a total enrollment of 1,651, which means we have adequate capacity to absorb those students into the adjacent 3 buildings, making that a move that's doable. When we apply that same logic to Washington, we're distributing 274 students to Garfield, Madison, and McKinley. And again, the total enrollment then fits within the median of available capacity of those adjacent buildings. And then at Monroe, it's a little bit different. We have for sure distribution to Hayes, Jefferson, and Wilson, which actually the total enrollment of all buildings is at the bottom end, the minimum of capacity of those adjacent buildings. If we were to distribute to 4 adjacent buildings, we would actually not even impact the capacity at all. That 380 students would easily distribute. So this, are you able to read this? Okay. Okay, good. So this is based on...
Just to interrupt, we'll be sharing this with you as board members as well. So don't worry about doing too much writing. You'll get all this after this evening for sure.
This calculation didn't use Jackson.
Hold on a second. when you talk, you got to talk into the microphone. The people watching can't hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is, the prior slide shows Jackson. We actually didn't include Jackson on this count because we wanted to make sure that we could absorb capacity within 3 buildings. The Jackson is coming out based on where boundary study might be going. Yes.
I think the one big question I have then, is this going to assume the average class size of most of our class? What is it? I don't know how many we have in every kindergarten. It's K through 2, I think, and then like 3 through 6 is a slightly different number.
Yeah, we have not assumed increasing class sizes as part of this analysis. So the number of classrooms per grade level is based on the original capacity study, so available classroom spaces. What I think this will do is it will allow you to a big extent to kind of level out. The more sections we have per grade level in a given building or attendance area, the more likely you are to not have one building with, I'm making these numbers up, 14 kids in a kindergarten classroom and a building next door with 22 kids in a classroom, right? You'll be able to start to soften some of those. That obviously I think is a more acceptable opportunity for all students, meaning they're having a more similar experience. But it also boils down to teachers and cost, right? There's a direct impact to having the right number of educators. And we're not talking about ballooning class size to achieve this.
So there is an attendance boundary change exploration underway. Likely a first draft could be available next week. It is not quite ready tonight. That boundary is a little bit of a tricky one, and that is attempting to draw the boundaries on major roads or sensible areas such as creeks or boundaries that don't divide neighborhoods in half. So that's a little bit of a challenge. It is respective of trying to work with the capacities that we've calculated and also making sure we don't exceed those student ratios in classrooms. So that is going to be a first draft. It will not be perfect. That being said, once that boundary change starts to be speculated, then also financials can start to be speculated as well. One of the things that happens when you make these building closures is you're going to redistribute funds to a greater number of students through those fewer number of buildings, meaning currently the district has Title I funds in a particular building. Now you're going to distribute where those touch more students because now you're covering those out of a greater population base in those fewer elementaries. And so that data will start to be built once you know where the boundaries move with those buildings. So that is a very quick snapshot of an initial step. So I'm going to pause because I think that takes a little bit of discussion because that is a weighty topic of actually naming some buildings to consider for closure.
Director Beck.
So I know with Washington, that's a historic building, and it is located on the same property with Sudlow. What would happen? You know, are we assuming that we're then going to put all of these buildings up for sale or close them so that the maintenance costs are much, much lower and then figure out what to do with them later? Especially on a property like the Sudlow Washington one, you know, you can't just sell it to the nearest strip mall developer, right? Because that's a property that's adjacent to a school. So
no, great question. And I'll generalize the majority of the savings achieved by closing a school is going to be through the staffing efficiencies gained. TJ, is that fair? So there are savings associated, obviously, with not heating and cooling and insuring and cleaning. Don't get me wrong, but the biggest dollar amount is going to come from your staffing efficiencies that you gain. The Washington site specifically, given its adjacency to Sudlow, that is one I think where the district and the board eventually, if an investment is to be made in Sudlow, or we simply decide to keep Sudlow in its current state as one of our junior highs, 6, 8 middle schools moving forward. I think they would benefit from additional green space and property and parking and all the stuff that comes with it. So Washington may be a candidate to be raised and turned into additional space to support Sudlow.
I'm going to also follow that up. So there had been a study done previously in the district looking at the nature of buildings from a historic standpoint. None of the buildings within the district are actually labeled on a historic listing. They haven't been local landmark or designated as historic. That means that the district could be free and clear to raise that building without complication. We would recommend that, there's a good process that you can take to do that so that you can honor the historic nature of that building before doing so. As we look at cost projections long-term, one of the costs that you would look at is what does it take to raise that building and end up with a green space. If it was a decision to sell a building, location does matter when it comes to development. Typically, historic buildings are good for residential redevelopment. However, that doesn't apply unanimously. Location does matter when developers look at those investments.
Director Klein-Jerome.
Okay, so I look at Monroe and we would send kids east, west, and north. We look at Washington, we're sending them east, west, and north. That all makes sense to me. You look at Buchanan and we're sending them northeast, northeast, and further northeast. That doesn't seem like the building that should be closed when we're sending them all in the same direction. Just something to think about that I'm thinking about.
Good feedback, and I think the detailed boundary analysis, which is in process now, will help maybe bring a little more perspective to that. It wasn't easy. We met every Friday morning for 10, 12 weeks, and I think every other Friday the buildings listed changed because there was different variables and dynamics, and so I think that's really helpful feedback. While we want to continue to move with some urgency, right, as a board to hopefully get to resolution of this in the next couple months, if you have thoughts, obviously this is a first thought on a recommendation. It's definitely not something we're suggesting you take any form of action on, even as early as next week. But if you have thoughts, that's a great point of perspective and feedback, and obviously that's why we hope to continue to gain that from you tonight and next week.
Director Hayes.
I think I'm on the path with Director Klein-Jerome, but I also coupled in transportation costs with that to ship the students off that far. Are we really saving? It's like 6 of one, a half dozen of the other, that we're increasing our costs in transportation.
So the transportation's being studied, TJ. The goal is to not add bus routes because that's where the cost incurred hits the district with a broader impact than simply expanding a route. So that the group that's doing the attendance boundary change is working hand in hand with district transportation department to explore what does it take to move those kids through the city. And unfortunately, we're not quite there yet.
Was that all you had? Director Gordon.
I'm feeling a little naive right now because all this time we've been talking about the impact to the students and where they'll go. But until that exchange a few moments ago talking about the biggest savings when closing buildings is the staffing cost, are we intending to reduce our staff so significantly that that's where those changes are going to be found? Because I don't remember discussing that before now.
Yeah, savings comes through efficiencies gained, not through increasing class sizes, not through cutting number of sections. If we make up some numbers, right, if you generally you could probably have one less classroom per grade level when you really start to consolidate, or two. And it's not as though that means we're laying off staff, right? We have plenty of openings at the moment to fill. So it's more about not filling currently open positions, and it's about being more efficient with how you allocate your staff. We can hopefully, as we get to slightly larger, but still not large elementary schools by any means, be more efficient with our specialists, our title programming we talked about, our FIAT instructors, our guidance counselors, all of those that some travel building to building now. Hopefully we'll start to find a home base where they can be more efficient, spend more time with kids. So it is not about an efficiency game of increasing class size to have less staff members. It's just inherently more efficient to operate less buildings and have a slightly larger total student population in a building than the way we're currently operating.
The operational savings alone, just your lights, power, what it takes, custodial for running those buildings is a $750,000 savings annually. If you compare that over the life of a bond, which is typically 20 years, that's $14 million over that same time that you would finance in a bond. So it is not insubstantial. But as Matt noted, there's opportunities to improve the way you deliver the curriculum, which will present savings.
I'm glad you asked that because that was not the intention of that comment. So thank you for letting me clarify.
Yeah, thanks for clearing that up, because when I hear efficiencies, to me, that's doing doing more with less. And we're already doing that. So I wanted to make sure that that was not what was happening. Thank you.
Director Potts.
Walcott has been a K-8 building with sixth graders. When we were in that configuration, I assume the sixth graders from Buffalo and Bluegrass were at Walcott. Okay. So if Walcott stayed a K-8 with the sixth graders, then what would be the impact? What might be the impact on Buffalo and Bluegrass in terms of their viability?
I think we have to look a little closer at just pulling sixth grade out. How much more under capacity are they operating at that point? I believe we have plenty of capacity in Walcott to bring sixth graders from two schools over. That's a building that's running under capacity as well. So I don't think, and I'm thinking out loud here, which is risky, I don't think it's an issue at Walcott in terms of available capacity. We will look more closely at Buffalo and Bluegrass to see what it means for their total enrollment versus capacity when done.
Hang on real quick. A follow-up to what Director Potts just said. So if Walcott stayed at K-8, then potentially some of the Buchanan kids with that boundary could potentially shift out that way as well.
There is flexibility to take advantage of available space at Walcott as we have, as you just described, or in other ways. So there is definitely space available there, and by moving a few more students west, that would free up the ability to be more efficient with our eastern or our city schools, let's say.
Director Beck.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've always wanted to make sure that we kind of kept in mind as we make changes like this is the concept of the neighborhood school and being able to walk, kids being able to walk. And I know walk boundaries are hard because the state walk boundary is not necessarily what a parent would agree is a safe distance. But when we're doing this kind of along the lines of the transportation question, not adding bus routes makes sense. I'm wondering, particularly with the sort of further west potential closings, what is the farthest that a student might potentially end up going that they wouldn't already be going now, right? I realize that we'll do the best we can to not, impact students who have already fed into the system, but what is the farthest that a student might have to move?
Yeah, until we see the detailed boundaries, it's hard to say. But I will say, the conversations have been focusing on if students need to move west. Let's say for that specific example, we've been looking at how many of those students already bus. So if there's a large percentage of students already busing from that general neighborhood, busing south or east versus west, it might be slightly different in terms of time, but it's not as though we're taking a student that walked or 50 students that walked and now are putting them on a bus. So that is one of the many factors. As to your point of safe roads to schools as well, that's why John noted kind of major roadways being an attempt to boundary at those, so that hopefully we have the opportunity for students to walk. I think we know it's less and less, right? It's just things are different than when we all went to school, but we still want to preserve the ability as much as possible for families that do choose to walk.
Student board members? Okay. Director Passion?
I mean, this is what I was looking for as far as closing buildings and not going through all the remodeling and everything until we can flush everything out and see exactly how this is going to affect the district. But again, we all realize something needs to be done now. Just to follow up, when you were talking about Washington and the possibilities of that building being raised and increasing the campus size at Sudlow, would that be also something that you might look at Monroe and Smart then?
Yes.
Yeah, the disposition of building is a critical conversation because that is potentially a financial impact. You may save money to close that building right out of the gate, but making the decision to raise that building also is an expenditure that you might want to incur. I will also say that we have explored other possibilities of building closures, and one thing that becomes evident is that at a certain point you need to look at how the path towards organizational change stitches together, and making those changes sequence either helps or hinders your ability to make those additional closures. And part of that is just because of the efficiencies that are gained by changing that organization. And so that is a much deeper conversation that probably could shed some light, but it also presumes that you're making some significant changes based on those topics as well.
Just one other thing to follow up with this, and when I was talking earlier about how we're going to spend our monies, we also have to think about there's obviously needs to be work done at North High School. I mean, there's still classrooms there that are still junior high sized classrooms. Some things that need to be done at West. One of them is going to be done as far as the additional gym. So we got to think about by closing these buildings, what we can do with the funds that we have available to get our buildings up to what they need to be.
We agree, and we've begun studying North in particular to just conceptualize how some of those challenges you just noted could be addressed. Again, no time frame for implementation, but beginning to create conceptual designs and ideas as to how those could be addressed.
Then am I correct then that with this proposal here, and I know there's a lot of things that have to be flushed out here yet, but there would be no remodelings taking place?
Not specifically connected to the school closures, correct? If the board would want to entertain investments, save dollars, PEPL, things like that, that is not connected to this. These closures do not rely on any additional expenditures of capital dollars.
And again, like I said before, I think this is what we need to do, and then see what happens. And then we can look at, okay, we need to remodel this school building, or we need to close an additional building, or we have to combine some buildings or whatever. But I think this is at least a start, and it's a start that we can handle financially.
Landon, go ahead.
So I am from North High School, and so I was curious. So right now, I believe, and obviously I don't have the statistics on hand, but I believe North has been increasing by about 50 students each year. That's simply what I heard. So there's, maybe no. Anyways, how does this closure and cleaning up the pathways affect, the middle schools and then the high schools and the students that they're getting like enrollment each year?
Yes. So near term, we still would have 4 junior high schools, correct? As part of this first phase, that would be feeding our 3 high schools plus Mid City. So, specifically, which junior highs feed which school building, and what percentage of those junior highs when we do split and go to different schools, is to be determined. That will be explored as we continue to look at this further. And I think, as you know, the variable of in-district choice regarding high school is always a variable that is a bit out of anybody in this room's control regarding where families and students choose to attend high school. So I don't have the particulars on are we truly growing 50 a year at North or not. But I think the great question you just asked is how does this affect high schools, which I think is a great question that the community will want to know an answer to.
Oh, go ahead, DJ.
So at the onset of this, the enrollment study was conducted, and the concerns from the community were surrounding our middle school level. And so part of the plan that we need to address is establishing a true feeder that actually programmatically feeds to our high schools, with an understanding that you can go to any high school that you want. But through the long range facility plan, strengthening what does it look like in a middle school? So the programmatic angles of that. Because when we look at our enrollment and when we talk with families, we are losing our families to surrounding districts at the middle school area. If you look at our high school, enrollment is steady. And so families are either choosing at the middle school time or before they even enroll based on that many times. That's what the data that we looked at. So your question is spot on. What is the pattern that we need to consider? And that's one of the huge considerations into this study, is that's long been a standing issue for many members of the community. Good job, Landon. And you're right, North has been steadily growing ever since the adding of the District of Distinction program at North.
Director Beck.
So one of the things that I believe we've talked about also is the fact that having this feeder, more of a true feeder system, is better for students because they build that consistency. They know where they're going. Again, assuming that students can choose to go to a different high school should they wish. So I'm wondering, how do we handle the fact that even with an organizational change, we're still going to end up sending students from one middle school to 2 different high schools, right? I mean, I grew up in a city where it was a big city, but we had one junior high going to one high school. So how do we still build that pride and that sense of feeder when we have that going on? I guess I would, and I know you don't necessarily have an answer for that, but
Yeah, I can give you the macro. I guess the macro is until we get to 3, right? 3 to 3 is obviously when we could begin to be a little more definitive if we wanted to as a district of if you attend junior high A, you attend high school A.
okay.
Still having 4 junior highs in this model, that obviously is never going to work. But 5, we could probably also start looking at, does an elementary boundary track at least as some pathway to a high school?
Okay. And I don't have any problem with it. I mean, it clearly makes way more sense now on this proposal than it does when you look at our current organizational chart. But just to make sure that students get that consistency that I think most of us have agreed is helpful.
And this was a phase one only. This was literally the closure of 3 elementary schools and what it did. This is not a future phase, a future investment at a junior high level, additional closures. This does not reflect that. So that conversation that the board will likely be having moving forward may impact that and may be able to provide a more predictable pathway.
And Dan, you're going to want to say, just to make it clear, no one is proposing closing any middle schools.
Because you know you got the media back there and they like to jump on that. It'll be the front page on the paper tomorrow. I got nothing better to write. Anything else? Nope, Director Poston.
So getting back to the middle schools, I mean, with a change of boundary or recreating a campus down the road, I mean, you could have a scenario where you've had one intermediate maybe feeding into 2 high schools and then maybe 2 intermediates into a particular high school. I mean, you could work out that scenario possibly.
That is correct, yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of was leading into my closing thing to see what they wanted from us. I was going to ask that stuff. Director Klein-Jerome.
We have not had discussions about Walcott, but we have certainly heard from Walcott. And I guess I was under the assumption it's because we wanted all of our junior highs to look alike. But now tonight, my feeling is it's because Bluegrass and Buffalo attendance will be lower. So that would be a conversation I really would like to have. Why are we getting rid of the elementary? If it is to boost Bluegrass and Buffalo, yeah, time out. You know, I want to have a conversation that what is the purpose here? And I'll be real honest and upfront. I taught at Walcott when it was K9. I taught at Walcott when it was K8. They could accommodate all those kids, and this was a long time ago when the population was probably higher. So I'm confused the purpose of it.
Yeah, we were talking through the concept of providing it's the same grade configuration for Buffalo, Bluegrass, Walcott, with Walcott being their junior high middle school in a 6-8 model versus a 7-8 model. That's really the impact in the phase 1 proposal. If we decide in phase 1 as a board to go to the 6-8 model, I'll say immediately. We still have to work out the timing of that tonight. We're really staying focused on school closing as priority 1. But when we talk about the eventual consideration of a 6-8 model, that's when we would be considering Buffalo and Bluegrass 6th graders transitioning to the Walcott building 1 year sooner than they currently do. So they have the middle school junior high experience like the rest of the district. That's, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's the extent of the conversation we've had regarding the impact of a grade configuration change on our west side schools.
Okay. What do you need from us to move forward with some different things? What general consensus or information do you need from us to help you all move forward?
I guess I will jump in and say any specific questions that you haven't already asked that you would like answered, right, to kind of advance this conversation to some more formality over the next 6 weeks. Obviously, we know boundaries, we know busing. I would assume I'm going to see heads nodding that those are 2 pretty important ones, and we're working on those. So we're good there. But are there any other kind of pressing or burning topics that you want us to be doing more analysis on in advance of not only next week, but then as we continue to kind of move towards a December potential, I will say vote. Is that fair, Dan? On this at some point in December.
And I'm going to piggyback on that and say, as a board, when you think of the implications of a community saying they're supporting the change from your current configuration of K6, 7, 8 to K5, 6, 8. What do you as a board want to see in terms of timing for a shift for that? Because that requires some level of planning and transition, and likely there would need to be some consideration of a bigger picture for the district, and how would you like to explore that vision for the district?
To be clear though, those are two. They're mutually exclusive of each other. Correct. We can close schools without switching to a 6-8 model. Fair.
Correct.
So now we're having those conversations blended in throughout the night, but I just want to make sure we're all comfortable with the fact that those aren't decisions that have to be made at the same time.
Superintendent?
At our cabinet, we discussed this as an outstanding opportunity that when our sixth graders do go back, that it looks different. We overwhelmingly heard that at the Facility Master Planning Committee. Well, you've already done that model and it didn't, right? So it has to be different. Whether or not we've done it in the last 30 years, Bruce, that's a different thing. Whether it be the house model, the programming model, infusing CT, all of the things that we heard from our Facility Master Planning Committee and community and the feedback that we've been given, it has to be different. It has to be different, and we have a great opportunity to get it right. So while we are right-sizing our district, begin now to build the programming and reinvest in the area in our district where our community is saying this is where we need to make the most change. In programmatic wise.
Hang on. She had her hand up like the whole time. Director Beck.
One thing I've been hearing a lot about is that in all of this planning, there's been no mention of the Creative Arts Academy. And I think that is something that's programmatic. It's not a facility and it's not its own school. But I think that's something important to make sure that we continue to talk about.
So now is the time, because we also don't children, all of the things that really could have drug us down and prevented us from getting to this spot, now they need to be considered. And the team at Bray has that on the mindset. So all of the ancillary things that we have to begin to look at are now's the time to begin to at least put them on. They have wonderful Gantt charts. Put those things on Gantt charts now.
So can I say, please model keeping the Creative Arts Academy?
Yeah, to date we have not had any conversations other than to keep the Creative Arts Academy, just to be clear. I will say there have been a foreshadow a little. We have only to date talked in a public setting regarding the elementary school closures. There have been some other opportunities for efficiency that have come to light as we've really dove deep, that when the time is right, if the board would like, we'd be happy to bring those ideas forward as well. Because the first three named tonight, potentially, there are some other opportunities that came to light as we dug deep in these that we may want to share with you as well.
Director Klein-Jerome.
TJ, in order to get our junior highs right, if we're going back to 6-8, is it realistic a timeline to say that would start in the fall of 2023, or we need an additional year to get it right? So it wouldn't start till 24, makes the timeline better.
Maybe even farther, but yes, not next year. That is not the current path. We do not believe that we could pull off the quality of programming, space, all of the reasons. So that's the current thinking right now, without getting too far ahead of
Director Klein-Jerome, to your question, would a timeline be beneficial? We could start to plot out. We have, at least we do it because it helps us start to think about how parts and pieces have to move. If you as a board would find that valuable, we could try to clean that up and formalize it a little bit more for you. Even at a really high level, and it'll be wrong, but at least it's a starting point for, okay.
All right, I got Director Gordon and then Director Poston.
I just have a few kind of ideas to throw out there, things to consider. I know that there had been discussion at some point of potentially building another elementary school in the Prairie Heights area. Is that what that's called? Oh, it was a middle school? Oh,
That was in phase one.
okay.
Phase one.
Okay, thanks. Well then, erase that part, but still same track. There are still families up in that area that are, I guess being spread out between a few, but is there any reasonable way that we could pull some of those students into Washington, pull some people out of Eisenhower, create more space there, pull more people into Washington, or move the Creative Arts Academy into Washington and also use it as a part-time elementary school? Like, I'm not saying don't close the building. I know we need to do that to save money, but like, before adding more money to restructure current options or to build something new, that may be something to take into consideration. And also, on a completely separate note, this is a probably bonkers idea, but if we're going to be thinking outside of the box, then maybe consider having separate buildings for 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. If we've got 5 buildings to use in a new way, that's a real good way to keep them all separate from each other. That's all.
Yeah, I think this is where we go with these, right? If we start to find some traction with our first phase, we start to hopefully envision or dream of what a phase 2 could be and how that could positively impact kids. And so you're starting to have some of those thoughts, which is good.
Director Poston.
So if we wait for 2 years to move the 6th graders, but we're closing 3 elementaries, are we going to have enough capacity still in the elementaries?
So the calculations that were run all were based on the current inclusion of 6th grade at the elementary level. So that does fit. Moving those students, as TJ noted, one of the big things that was cautioned is not to move them too soon, so that can be a programmatically beneficial move as opposed to just a hastily putting bodies in the buildings. So the calculation did need to be run to ensure that the impact of closing schools did not affect the organization as you currently exist.
There may be more opportunity for an elementary school closure at the point in which a 6th grade would obviously leave our elementary schools. So to your, I think maybe your broader point is there will potentially be the opportunity for a second phase of closure in the future when 6th grade leaves our elementaries.
Okay, because my concern was we're going to have a lot of excess capacity in the intermediate schools.
In the near term, yes. When we move 6th graders in, we're not.
Okay.
Director Beck.
So just to clarify, we're talking about potentially closing 3 buildings after this year, but moving 6th grade to middle school the following year. Is that correct?
I think at this point it would be in a few years. It would likely not be as soon as a year and a half from now, I don't believe. Is that fair, TJ?
So I guess I'm trying to figure out if we vote on something in December, it is simply to close 3 buildings that are elementary schools. And we'd still have all the remaining buildings and they'd still be K-6. Is that right? And that would start potentially, the goal would be to start that in the fall of 2023, right?
The closure would take effect
In the fall of
beginning the 23-24 school year. We
Okay.
would be operating 3 less K-6 elementary schools.
Next year,
Correct.
if we vote on that. Okay. And then at the same time or at a future, I mean, to envision all this, I feel like we kind of need to get ahead of the game. So at the same time, we potentially could be voting to move 6th grade back to middle school, but that would not take effect until at least fall of 2024. Is that correct? Maybe.
What I think is going to be a very beneficial next step is to bring the Gantt chart with the timeline.
Oh,
where
yeah.
we all can see it. And I think Matt has I think that will be very beneficial to see, because while there are multiple phases, the very first thing is this, and this is the very first conversation. We're also working on the different scenarios that go along and feed into that. And one thing I'm very proud of the team that works with us is they are building valves everywhere that allow us to move left or right in choosing the different scenarios that work. So this is the big first step, the big conversation piece to have. So I think a Gantt chart at the next moving forward will be, and I think that was very beneficial in the timeline because we were adjusting that, updating it, sending it in a Friday report, and I think that's just very beneficial to move forward.
And I will generally say the move to the 6-8 model is critically important, but it's going to take, as TJ noted a couple times, a lot of curricular alignment, right? And making sure we get that right. And so personal perspective is important decision. We have a general consensus, hopefully around that move. But I don't know that it's one I would race into for the sole purpose of getting that transition done versus being more strategic and planning for that transition.
But we would want to vote on it so that there's time to make the transition. Does that make sense?
I don't know that it is not critical. The decision to go to 6-8 does not affect the potential ability to close 3 schools. So if we want to bucket the decisions, I think bucket 1 is really the decision, if the board would like to make it, to close 3 schools. That is a kind of an isolated board action item. Whether you want to entertain continued conversations on grade configuration on those same evenings or at the same time, that's obviously board prerogative. But I do think it's important. We don't have to blend those 2 decisions together.
Okay. And then one last question. I think we're going to get a lot of feedback, like we typically do when we bring up these topics, why we should not close this building, why we should keep it open, why we should close a different building. And we have these giant board notebooks that tell us about the age of each building and the capacity and things like that. Is there, I guess I would ask that there be a publicly available version of these are the data.
I apologize. It is. If you go back to that meeting, it was posted on there.
Yes, but I want to make sure that people know
It's probably on our long-range facilities planning.
why
page,
this,
too.
I'm sorry, why this building versus that building. If we can make it a simple bullet chart, I know it's in there, we know it's in there, but people are going to ask, why these 3 buildings and not something else?
We can try to do a Cliff Notes version
Yeah.
of the why,
Or even
as
just-
long as it's viewed through the perspective of these were some of the considerations
Yeah.
used, not an exhaustive list. Not that you couldn't take those points and apply them to other schools and suddenly justify that building instead. So that's, I think, where we want to be a little careful, but I appreciate what you're saying. There should be a little context behind this.
Maybe just bringing that document to the front of the pile
Fair.
on the website would be helpful, I think.
Oh, good point.
I agree with that, but only like 4,700 people actually took a survey out of 47,000. So clearly it's not a big deal to them. I mean, I was really disappointed when you all told us it'd be like 11%. I was really disappointed. I thought that the numbers were going to be way higher. Director Poston.
Question for Kevin. So closing 3 buildings from a financial standpoint, is this going to be enough to enable us to have the money available for curriculum, paying our teachers more? Is this enough from a financial standpoint?
Kevin, it's perfectly okay to say that you're going to need some time to figure that out.
To pay them more, yes, you'll have more money to spread. It's just a matter of where you decide to set to reinvest those money. It's resource reallocation is what I call it. You won't have the utilities, you won't have the overhead costs. What you use them for is kind of a board choice. you would be putting more dollars into salaries to be more competitive. That is an option that the board has. It's one that we've talked about quite a bit. There are other things that are curricular in nature, like you said, adopting curriculum. It's a huge one we need to improve on. So there'd be some of that going on as well. So yes, there would it do absolutely everything we need to do? I can't tell you because you'd have to tell me how much you want to put in each one of those buckets.
From a Pebble standpoint, in that, are we going to have enough I don't want to say excess funds, but enough funds to meet our needs? Say we do some work at North, we've got issues with roofs on some of the buildings. Will we be able to cover all that with either SAVE or Pebble funds?
Yes, when we were looking at the planning of doing some of these projects, we held back dollars for facility improvements, whether it be roofs, whether it be tuck pointing, whatever it is, HVAC. The other thing that wasn't said yet tonight is in March there will be a revenue purpose statement that will be voted on. We already set the hearing date for January 9th, I believe, to put that on a ballot. When that passes, then all of that stuff will become much clearer, and to be able to use those funds, it will require some of those bigger things will require us to issue bonds, but it's not a vote of the taxpayers. It is sales tax dollars, so it's not a property tax impact.
But we should be able to cover that.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So I will make it perfectly crystal clear what I am looking for, because I think we bounced around a lot. I would like a hard timeline on what it would take to get this phase done, how many phases it would take to get the entire thing done, and then what other, along with the other, like the upgrades at North and West and things like that, built into that, so that we know we can get those things done with the monies allocated. And then also, when you're putting it together, I would like to see, if Walcott stayed at K-8, the pathways on that, I would like to see it be a true feeder pathway. If you go to this elementary, you're going to this junior high, and then you're going to this high school. I'm not factoring in open enrollment. I'm just, if you do boom, 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 so because we're so split up, sometimes it really affects a lot of things. And then if you can fit in there what the game plan is for Creative Arts Academy. I think I pegged off everything that I needed.
I was just going to say that sounds like a simple request you just made, but no, we'll work on all of that. No guarantees on the lottery ticket, no.
Well, I think if you can put it together like that, I think that answers a lot of the questions that came up or whatever, and then we have a clear direction. And I will add this in there because, I mean, you had talked about maybe future closures and things like that. If that's added in there, so we kind of have a baseline on that, if that does include a junior high or whatever to get to where we need to be. And I do want to point out, and I know Director Pashan said a bunch about didn't want to remodel and all that, but I just don't want to wind up to where we're like North High School and these kids have had junior high classrooms when we had the time that we should have did something before we wait till it gets too far down the road and then we're trying to fix things. And then if you could give us like the information on if we needed to raise the buildings or whatever, obviously we would need that at SMART for that campus as well as Sudlow. So I think that summed it up for me.
Thank you.
And just to reiterate, we cannot guarantee a winning lottery number selection.
Is there anything else? Director Kleindrum.
I don't want to put pressure on you, TJ, but if we're going to this 6-8 model, I would like to say 2024. That's a year and a half. It seems to me we could get it together by then. We're not reinventing the wheel. It's out there somewhere. But if we're kicking it down the can 2025, that seems too far away.
Director Pasha.
And I agree 100%. Because to me, we're sitting there with the excess capacity then in the intermediate. So we move the sixth graders and then we do something with the intermediate. But I don't want us to just prolong it, because that's what the problem has been. That's why we're having to close so many schools now, because the can kept getting kicked down the road and nobody did anything about it. So I think we've got to stay on point, and we've got to make sure that, we just don't keep stalling and putting it off and putting it off.
So along those lines, you might have to do a couple timelines. I imagine you're probably
Sounds
going
good.
to need to do some work at some of the junior highs to be able to accommodate some of that.
This is this phase 2 timing, investment, no investment, which schools. It should be exciting because it has the potential to positively impact the environments that students learn in every day, and have the potential to continue to attract, hopefully, and retain top-notch staff at those junior high levels. But that takes a little more time. And again, we wanted to make sure that we were being diligent to priority one being, let's find hopefully a path forward at the board level for an initial round of closures. Director Poston, completely hear your perspective and agree that there's more opportunity potentially to become more efficient through closures. And we will bring those forward as we uncover them in this next round of analysis.
Director Pasha.
I think, the positive about this is that, if we do this right and we get it right, that down the road, then, if we have to do more closures and that, but then I think we show the public, we show the taxpayers, okay, this is what we've done. This is how we've improved our district. Now, keep in mind, we still have a bunch of old buildings out there. So then we can go and maybe build a brand new elementary or an intermediate or whatever, and replace some of these older buildings. And then people will take more pride in the community. You got a brand new, efficient building. So should make it easier to pass a bond referendum.
Anything else? Going once. Going twice. That's the only thing we had to talk about tonight, right?
Just that.
All right. Director Potts, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. We were having such a good time. So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Ayes have it. Meeting adjourned.